A hiker's dog starts barking excitedly at something washed up on the rocky shoreline of Fishlake, Utah. It's May 16, 2025, and what appears to be an old hiking boot sits partially buried in the sand and debris. The hiker approaches, expecting to find typical lake trash, maybe a boot lost by some careless camper. But as they get closer, they realize this boot isn't empty. Inside, perfectly preserved by the cold mountain lake waters, are the skeletal remains of a human foot. This discovery is about to solve a mystery that has haunted searchers and a grieving family for 28 years. Before we dive into this incredible case, make sure to like this video and subscribe. This is a story that will stay with you long after it ends. Back in September 1997, David White of Washington, Utah, vanished without a trace while fishing on this very same lake. His empty boat was found trolling aimlessly across the water, his hat floating nearby, but David himself had simply disappeared into the mountain wilderness. For nearly 3 decades, his family lived with the agony of not knowing what happened to their beloved father and husband. Then, a single boot containing DNA evidence emerged from the depths, finally ready to tell its story. September 1997 was supposed to be a perfect fishing trip for David White. The Washington, Utah resident had been looking forward to spending time at Fishlake with friends, planning to cast his lines into the pristine mountain waters that had drawn anglers for generations. Fishlake, Utah's largest natural mountain lake, sits at an elevation of 8,843 feet in the Fishlake National Forest, known for its crystal-clear waters and abundant trout population. David had meticulously planned the trip, even going so far as to rent a hotel room near the lake to serve as base camp for the fishing expedition. He was an experienced outdoorsman who understood the mountain environment and respected the power of nature. Friends and family knew him as a careful, responsible person who wouldn't take unnecessary risks on the water. But, as often happens with group plans, complications arose. David's fishing companions had to cancel at the last minute, leaving him with a choice: abandon the trip he'd been anticipating, or proceed alone to enjoy the solitude of mountain fishing. Being the independent spirit he was, David decided to go fishing anyway. He wasn't going to let a change in plans rob him of time on the water he loved. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, but the evidence paints a troubling picture. Sometime during that September day in 1997, David's boat was discovered trolling aimlessly across Fishlake's surface with no one aboard. The vessel moved slowly through the water under its own power, creating an eerie sight that immediately alarmed other visitors to the lake. Search teams quickly mobilized when the empty boat was reported. As they scanned the water and shoreline, they made additional disturbing discoveries. David's hat was found floating in the lake, along with one of his shoes. These items, combined with the unmanned boat, painted a grim scenario. It appeared that David White had somehow fallen into the frigid mountain water. The Sevier County Sheriff's Office launched an extensive search operation, deploying search and rescue teams across the lake and surrounding wilderness. Divers plunged into Fishlake's depths, searchers combed the rocky shoreline, and teams scoured the dense forest that surrounds the water. Despite their exhaustive efforts, no trace of David himself could be found. The circumstances of his disappearance were particularly puzzling because there were no witnesses to whatever had occurred. No other boaters saw him fall overboard. No hikers spotted him in distress. No one heard calls for help echoing across the water. David White had simply vanished, leaving behind only an empty boat, a floating hat, and a single shoe as evidence of his presence on the lake. For David's family, including his daughters who would grow up without their father, the lack of concrete answers was devastating. They knew something terrible had happened, but without finding David's body, they couldn't achieve the closure that comes with definitive knowledge of a loved one's fate. The case remained open, but as years passed, hope of finding answers grew dim. The immediate response to David White's disappearance mobilized every available resource in Sevier County. Sheriff's deputies, search and rescue volunteers, and specialized dive teams converged on Fishlake within hours of the empty boat's discovery. The urgency was palpable. In mountain lake conditions, survival time in the water is measured in minutes, not hours. Fishlake presented unique challenges for searchers. Despite being Utah's largest natural mountain lake, its maximum depth reaches approximately 160 feet, with crystal-clear water that should have made underwater visibility excellent. However, the lake's size, roughly 6 miles long and 1 mile wide, created an enormous search area. The cold water temperature, even in September, meant that if David had fallen in, hypothermia would have set in rapidly. The dive teams worked systematically, using sonar equipment to map the lake bottom and identify potential locations where a body might have settled. They focused particularly on areas near where the boat had been found drifting and where David's hat and shoe were recovered. The theory was straightforward. David had somehow fallen overboard and his body would be somewhere in the vicinity of these discovered items. Search and rescue coordinator Gary Moulton from Fishlake Lodge became a central figure in the operation. His intimate knowledge of the lake's currents, depth variations, and seasonal patterns proved invaluable in directing search efforts. Moulton understood how objects and bodies moved through Fishlake's waters, knowledge that would prove crucial both in 1997 and decades later. The community response was overwhelming. Local volunteers joined professional searchers, creating a small army of people determined to bring David home to his family. Boats crisscrossed the lake in grid patterns, searchers walked every accessible mile of shoreline, and teams ventured into the surrounding forest in case David had somehow made it to shore before succumbing to hypothermia or injury. As days turned into weeks, the search parameters expanded. Investigators considered alternative theories. Could David have survived the initial incident but become lost in the wilderness? Had he suffered a medical emergency that caused him to fall overboard? Was there any possibility of foul play, despite the remote location and lack of witnesses? The discovery of David's shoe and hat suggested a straightforward drowning scenario, but the absence of his body created troubling questions. Bodies typically surface in mountain lakes within days or weeks as decomposition gases cause them to rise. The fact that David's remains weren't found despite extensive searching puzzled investigators and added to the family's anguish. Detective Sergeant Pearson and Detective Sergeant Larson took lead roles in the investigation, documenting every piece of evidence and following up on every possible lead. They interviewed David's family, friends, and anyone who might have seen him before his disappearance, building a comprehensive timeline of his final known movements. 28 years after David White vanished into the depths of Fishlake, a routine hike was about to crack open one of Utah's most enduring missing person cases. On May 16, 2025, an unnamed hiker was walking along the lake's shoreline with their dog when the animal began exhibiting unusual behavior, barking persistently at something half buried in the rocky debris along the water's edge. What caught the dog's attention was a hiking boot, weathered by decades of exposure but still remarkably intact. At first glance, it appeared to be typical lake trash, the kind of discarded footwear that occasionally washes ashore at popular recreation areas. However, as the hiker approached for a closer look, they realized this wasn't an empty boot discarded by a careless visitor. Inside the boot were the unmistakable remains of human skeletal material, specifically the bones of a human foot still partially articulated within the confines of the leather and synthetic boot material. The cold, alkaline waters of Fishlake had acted as a natural preservative, maintaining the integrity of both the boot and the organic remains within it for nearly 3 decades. The hiker immediately contacted authorities, understanding the potential significance of their grisly discovery. Within hours, the Sevier County Sheriff's Office had secured the scene and began the careful process of evidence collection. Detective Sergeant Pearson, who had worked the original case in 1997, felt a surge of recognition when he examined the boot. Its style and apparent age seemed consistent with footwear from the late 1990s. The boot itself became a crucial piece of evidence. Investigators traced its manufacturing date to 1996, just 1 year before David White's disappearance, a timeline that fit perfectly with the cold case. The style, size, and condition all matched what searchers might expect to find from someone who had been missing since 1997. But the real breakthrough came when the remains were transported to the Utah Medical Examiner's Office for analysis. Forensic experts carefully extracted bone samples from the foot remains, recognizing that after 28 years, DNA analysis would be the only definitive way to identify these remains. The preservation was remarkable. The cold lake environment had maintained enough organic material for genetic testing. The DNA extraction process required specialized techniques given the age of the remains and their extended exposure to lake water. Forensic scientists worked meticulously to isolate genetic material from the bone samples, knowing that this might be the only chance to provide answers to a family that had waited nearly 3 decades for closure. Simultaneously, investigators reached out to David White's family to request DNA samples for comparison. His daughter, Stephanie Bennett, agreed to provide a sample, understanding that this discovery might finally answer the questions that had haunted her family since she was young. The samples were sent to Bode Cellmark Forensics, a leading DNA analysis laboratory specializing in forensic genetics. The lab's experts understood the significance of this case, not just for the White family, but for the law enforcement officers and search and rescue volunteers who had never forgotten the missing fisherman from 1997. The stage was set for a definitive answer to a mystery that had persisted for over a quarter-century. The DNA analysis at Bode's Cellmark Forensics represented the culmination of decades of advances in forensic science. When the boot was discovered in 1997, DNA testing existed, but was far less sophisticated and reliable than today's methods. The intervening years had brought revolutionary improvements in genetic analysis, making it possible to extract and analyze DNA from samples that would have been useless to earlier generations of forensic scientists. The laboratory technicians faced significant challenges in processing the 28-year-old bone samples. Extended exposure to lake water, temperature fluctuations, and natural decomposition processes had all potentially degraded the genetic material. However, the unique environment of Fishlake, with its cold temperatures and specific mineral content, had actually helped preserve the DNA better than might have been expected. The analysis process involved multiple steps of extraction, purification, and amplification. Scientists used advanced techniques to isolate nuclear DNA from the bone matrix, then employed sophisticated amplification methods to generate enough genetic material for comparison testing. The process took weeks, with each step carefully monitored to ensure accuracy and prevent contamination. When the results came back, they were definitive beyond any reasonable doubt. The DNA from the foot remains showed a 99.9994% certainty of being related to Stephanie Bennett's sample, with the relationship being that of father and daughter. This extraordinarily high confidence level meant there was virtually no possibility of error. The remains were definitively those of David White. The news was delivered first to the White family, a moment that Detective Sergeant Larson later described as both heartbreaking and healing. Stephanie Bennett and her family had lived for 28 years with questions about their father's fate. While the discovery confirmed their worst fears about his death, it also provided the closure they had desperately needed. Sheriff Nathan J. Curtis personally called the family to share the results, understanding the profound impact this news would have on people who had spent most of their adult lives wondering what happened to their loved one. The conversation was emotional, filled with tears of both grief and relief as decades of uncertainty finally came to an end. The identification also brought closure to the search and rescue volunteers who had participated in the original 1997 search operation. Many of these dedicated individuals had carried the weight of the unsolved case for nearly 3 decades, wondering if they had missed something or could have done more. Learning that David's remains had finally been found and identified provided them with professional and personal satisfaction. Investigators were able to piece together a more complete picture of what likely happened on that September day in 1997. The location where the boot was found, combined with lake current patterns and the position of David's boat when it was discovered, suggested that he had indeed fallen overboard and drowned. The boot had likely remained submerged for years before lake-level changes, erosion, or other environmental factors brought it to the surface and eventually to shore. The fact that only the boot with the foot remains was found raises questions about the location of the rest of David's body. Lake dynamics, scavenging by fish and other aquatic life, and the natural decomposition process over nearly 3 decades could account for the dispersal of other remains. The boot itself had probably protected the foot bones from these processes, creating the perfect preservation conditions that allowed for this identification 28 years later. The identification of David White's remains brought profound closure to a case that had haunted the Sevier County Sheriff's Office and the local community for nearly 3 decades. Sheriff Nathan J. Curtis expressed the collective relief felt by law enforcement when he stated, "This case has been on the mind of every one of the SAR members who were involved in the search 28 years ago. It is good to finally have some closure for the family and the searchers." For the White family, the confirmation provided the answers they had sought since 1997, even though those answers came with renewed grief. Stephanie Bennett, speaking on behalf of the family, demonstrated remarkable grace in her response to the discovery. Her public statement reflected both gratitude for the closure and recognition of the many people who had never given up on finding her father. The family's thanks extended to multiple parties who had played crucial roles over the years. They specifically acknowledged the Sevier County Sheriff's Office, the search and rescue teams, Detective Sergeant Pearson, Detective Sergeant Larson, Sheriff Curtis, and Gary Moulton from Fishlake Lodge. Each of these individuals had contributed to either the original search efforts or the recent identification process. Perhaps most poignantly, the family expressed deep gratitude to the anonymous hiker and their dog whose chance discovery had finally broken the case open. Without this individual's decision to report what they found rather than simply walking away, the White family might have continued living with unanswered questions indefinitely. The case resolution had broader implications for missing person investigations in remote areas. It demonstrated the importance of maintaining open case files even when leads go cold, and showed how advances in forensic science can breathe new life into decades-old mysteries. The DNA analysis techniques that made this identification possible simply didn't exist in their current form when David first disappeared. For the search and rescue community, the case provided validation of their efforts and renewed motivation for future searches. The knowledge that their 1997 search operation had been thorough and professional, and that the failure to locate David's body was due to environmental factors rather than inadequate searching, provided important professional closure. The case also highlighted the unpredictable nature of evidence recovery in wilderness environments. The boot's appearance on the shoreline in 2025 was likely the result of complex environmental factors, including changing lake levels, erosion patterns, and seasonal weather variations that finally brought this crucial evidence to the surface after nearly 3 decades underwater. David White's case officially transitioned from a missing person investigation to a closed death case, allowing his family to finally lay their questions to rest while honoring his memory with the knowledge of what actually happened on that September day in 1997. The resolution of David White's disappearance after 28 years stands as a testament to the enduring power of hope, the advances of modern science, and the importance of never giving up on the missing. This case reminds us that sometimes answers come not through dramatic breakthroughs or intensive investigations, but through the simple act of a hiker paying attention to what their dog found interesting along a shoreline. The story of David White illustrates the unique challenges faced by families of missing persons, particularly in cases where the circumstances strongly suggest death, but no body is recovered. For nearly 3 decades, the White family lived in a state of suspended grief, knowing their loved one was likely gone but unable to achieve the closure that comes with definitive answers. Their grace throughout this ordeal, and their gratitude toward everyone who helped solve the mystery, speaks to the strength of the human spirit in the face of profound uncertainty. This case also demonstrates how environmental factors can preserve evidence far longer than anyone might expect. The specific conditions of Fishlake, its cold temperatures, mineral content, and depth, created a natural preservation system that kept crucial DNA evidence viable for nearly 30 years. It's a reminder that nature sometimes holds on to secrets far longer than we imagine possible. For law enforcement and search and rescue professionals, David White's case reinforces the importance of thorough documentation and the value of keeping cold cases accessible for future investigation. The officers and volunteers who worked tirelessly in 1997 can now know that their efforts were not in vain, and that their professional dedication helped provide a foundation for eventual resolution. The unnamed hiker who discovered the boot deserves recognition as an unsung hero in this story. Their decision to report what they found, rather than ignoring it, gave a family the answers they desperately needed and allowed a dedicated law enforcement community to finally close a case that had weighed on them for decades. If this story of perseverance, family love, and eventual closure moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more investigative stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below about the importance of never giving up hope. Sometimes the most profound mysteries are solved not by brilliant detective work, but by ordinary people doing the right thing when faced with the extraordinary.